All right. So, set the scene. We got Jesus was asked, or actually, I think it was Andrew and Philip were asked by the Greeks to see Jesus. And that is the setting and the scene within Pentecost for after Jesus had been at where Lazarus was, at Bethany. There's two Bethanys, and I've been rewriting on Centurion, so now my brain is stuck full of a lot of the Aramaic. So if I say something Aramaic, I'll try to translate it. So anyway, because when I wrote the book, I put all the, it's kind of incorrect, but I put a lot of the, when they were talking Aramaic, I use the Aramaic words. When they're speaking Greek and Latin, I put in the anglicized versions of those. But anyway, so he was at Bethany, and actually he was up doing some really interesting things in Samaria, which we talked about before. And then he went down to Passover, and now he's at the Passover in Jerusalem. And he had just come from Bethany, and he was asked by the Greeks. Now, why this is so important? This is almost, this isn't the climax of John, but this is, and I don't remember what we used to call it in literature, but you know how you can move into a very, very important part of the writing that's not necessarily the climax, but it's what the author wants you to, your takeaway, right? I mean, today we mark them, we put them on the bottom of the slides and say, here's the takeaway from this slide, and you go, huh? If you didn't explain it well enough at the beginning, what do you think you're going to explain it well enough at the bottom of the slide? But anyway, this is kind of John's takeaway, because I told you that John, in spite of what we talk about it, which I think is kind of funny, we talk about it as being the most Hebrew of the Gospels, but it's a late Gospel, and I think it's obviously written for the Greeks and Romans. So when we see John, especially talking about the Greeks and Romans, and here we got Jesus, we got Philip and Andrew bringing the Greeks to Jesus and saying, and the Greeks want to see him. Well, then we have this dialogue by Jesus, which is really an interesting dialogue. In the middle of the Semaon, there's a sign. God speaks to Christ, actually to the people. Remember, Christ says, this isn't saying said for me, but for you. And then we get into this part. So let me see. I'll go back to the top, or to the translation. Here's the translation. Is verses 31. At present, a decision is of that which was created, the creation. Of him at present, the ruler of chief of that which was created, that is the creation, the cosmos. Of him will be thrown outside of doors. And I didn't mention this, but you notice when I put the genitive case, the possessive case, we call it in English possessive. In English we say this would be apostrophe S, but you can also use the of construction for a preposition to make it a genitive case, a possessive case. But it says, of him will be thrown outside of doors. In other words, of him will be thrown outside, not of the creation, but of the gay. And we're going to get to that in a second. We'll see that in a second. But it's not him himself, but the possession of him will be thrown. The genitive case will be thrown outside of doors. Now, in English, unfortunately, I don't think we got enough grammar, but that's okay. Everybody thinks they got enough and way more than enough, right? But if you weren't doing sentences, right, they always make a joke about, what do you call it, diagramming sentences? What's that? The fish, or whatever diagrams you had. They used to diagram sentences like crazy until like the 1950s, and then we made a joke of it.
Yeah. Diagrammed in the 90s, so it wasn't completely gone.
It wasn't completely gone. Thank God for that. If we're still doing grammar, that's a positive. But anyway, because with grammar, you can understand other languages, and you can understand the really, this isn't, what do you call it? It's not hidden. It's not obtrusive. It's not a secret thing. but it to the reader, to the person who understands like the Greek, right? You go, oh, I get it. Now, Jesus goes on, and we have this. Here's the NIV, and I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw people to myself. Okay, we already can see there's something interesting here. Here's the verse. It's a relatively short verse. King James, and I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to me. Men, in King James is great because it tells us when they've added word. So if it's in italics, it's been added. Here's what it says, literally. Kego is and I. So that's your ego form. In case that I am raised high, elevated, and by the way, this word means exalted, from out or from among the gay. The gay, not the cosmos, the gay. All or the whole I will drag forward of me. Okay, so in case that if and I am raised high, exalted out from among the soil, the whole I will drag forward to me. Now, this is kind of a complex saying in Greek, but do you see? Okay, our translators made it simple for us, right? If I'm lifted up from the earth, oh boy. No, Jesus was talking about being thrown out of doors, right? Of him, the possession of him, the being of him, being thrown outside of doors, outside of the gay, outside the world. But he can't be thrown outside he could be thrown outside of the creation, except that he is a creation. Remember this? Since they're not doing the classes, so we don't get everything erased. But remember, in the plenum of everything, that's where God, and by the way, Christ is God, right? So Christ, God, the Holy Spirit exist as a four-dimensional being in the plenum of everything. Well, when God created, and the Amar is Christ, the command word is Christ, created the cosmos, that means that, is God in the cosmos? He permeates the cosmos, right? Because the cosmos is part of that plenum of everything where God exists. God is. God is everything, right? And so the cosmos is part of that plenum of everything. So God has to permeate the cosmos. But it was created by Christ. So within that, we have the philosophy and we have the gay. Well, if Christ is being tossed out of the gay, he's not outside the cosmos. He still permeates it. He's still within it. The point of this is really interesting. I am raised high. I am exalted. Now, you notice how we translate it. This is not a totally incorrect translation, but it does kind of give you a different feel, right? If I be lifted up from the earth, from the gay, I will draw all men unto me. Let's see, what did the NIV say? The NIV said, I'll draw all people to myself. Well, as we know in Greek, pantos means all or the whole. So what does he mean? Is it people?
The whole creation.
Yeah, the whole of the gay, right? And yeah, you're not wrong, because the whole creation is kind of coming along with him. But the whole point is that it isn't just the people, it's everything. Everything. In spite of the fact that, remember, John doesn't address this, the other Gospels do. And when we looked at the other Gospels, we talked a little bit about this. The prince and power of the air, the prince and power of the gay is Satan. And that's because of humankind, right? The sin of Adam, the whole thing that Satan is in charge of the gay. Well, if Christ does this, this is a really interesting conundrum, right? Within the context of this prince and power. Because the presumption is, and here's what we've done. Okay, I'm not talking about theology, but I'll tell you historically, what have we done with this issue? Those who have been convinced of Christ are not under the power of Satan, right? because they're under the power of Christ through his actions. But you notice what this is. It's very interesting. In case that I am raised up, I'm exalted out from among the gay, the whole I will drag forward to me. I will drag forward to me. Not call, not, what do they say? Oh, go draw. That's probably better, draw. But I will drag it forward. Whoa. Very interesting, beautiful statements. And look what our author says. We'll see what it says in the Greek. He said this showed the kind of death he was going to die in the NIV. This, he said, signifying what death he should die. Now, again, this is stated to Greeks. I'm not sure how we should resolve this. I think I have some comments down here. But let's see what it says in the Greek. And this is a longer statement than the King James or the NIV would lead us to believe. To him, her, but he was making a logical argument. He making a supernatural ceremonial indication, two, of what sort of death he was intended to die off. But to this, he was making a logical argument. He making a supernatural or ceremonial indication, a semeon, two, of what sort of death he was intended to die off. In other words, John calls this a semeon, a miracle, a sign. Well, that kind of makes you scratch your head, right? Because, he doesn't obviously intend the semeon of God to Christ. He means the semeon of this being exalted, being lifted up. Now, we know the end of the story, right? You're messed up already. Well, the hearers did too. They knew what was going to happen to Christ, right? He's going to be crucified. He's going to be lifted up on a Roman stake. They didn't even call it cross. They called it stake, steris. We'll see that. But they'll lift him up. And this is what is being indicated to the Greeks. Now, although this was a common way of Roman execution, it wasn't necessarily a common way of executing people other than the Romans. The Romans were really into this kind of thing. They thought it really inhibited criminality, and it may do that. But, because we'll talk about it when we get to the crucifixion itself, about how it was done. But, this is a puzzlement almost. This idea that this statement itself is a semeon. So,
I've always wondered, so many other times in the Bible, the Jews have stoned someone to death.
right.
They stoned Stephen, and they're going to stone the woman. Why did they bother going to the Romans and doing all this? Why didn't they just stone Jesus?
Well, in Centurion, I try to cover all that, but remember the edict from Pontius Pilate that was his law. And in Centurion, since I've been reading the book, I recognize, hey, I did some pretty good stuff here. It was an agreement between Pontius Pilate and the Sanhedrin, that the Sanhedrin could do their law, could do all their law, except not do corporeal punishment or executions, could not execute people based on their law. So they had to go to Pilate. Now, what you say is true. Well, Pontius Pilate was gone from the scene by the time of Stephen. Now, he wasn't gone during the time, but remember the woman who was going to be stoned for adultery? That's a Gnostic ad. So,
but they did start to try to stone Jesus on at least one occasion, as I recall. They picked up stones to stone him,
and he disappeared.
And and he was, where was he? Remember where he was?
His own town.
He was in the Galilee. Okay. This
outside the law.
Well, outside of Judah,
right.
Outside Judea, outside of let's see if I can draw a picture. There's a red one. This one, A legal red one?
I don't know, make sure line up, because we'll get in so much trouble.
Dry erase marker. It's dry erase.
Oh.
Dry erase is good, right? Yeah. The thing that we don't understand, and I got this really clueful about Jesus' time. You have the Galilee, right? And who was in charge of Galilee still? Herod Antipas. Yeah, Herod Antipas. Herod the Great was in charge of all of it. All four. There's 4 areas. And down below was Judea and Jerusalem. Jerusalem was in Judea. This is where Pontius Pilate was in charge. So did Pontius Pilate's little rulings have anything to do with the Galilee? Yep.
And in John 10, he's actually in Jerusalem, in the temple.
And they tried to take him, right? Not stone him.
It says the Jews picked up stones again to stone him.
Well,
Because it says, verse 22, at that time the feast of dedication took place in Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple. And then they asked him, how long will you keep us in suspense? If you're the Christ, tell us plainly. And he started to talk to them, and then they were going to stone him right there.
and what would have happened if they had even tried? What would the Sanhedrin have done? You know?
They probably would have killed them.
Well, they would have stopped him because, as I note in Centurion, the Romans, and a lot of this is reading between the lines, because it's the Archcode documents. When I wrote Centurion, I had the Greek sources, the Latin sources, the Archcode documents. I put them all together. But most likely, and this is what I put in Centurion, the temple guard was allowed to keep their weapons as long as they were within the temple area. Now, the Sanhedrin maintained the temple area. What would the Sanhedrin have done? At least from my account and from what I understand, the Sanhedrin would have stopped them. There's no way they would have let that happen. The other one, the big one, was when he was in the Galilee. And the Galilee, they probably could have got away with it. Now, the woman who was caught in adultery, that's probably a Gnostic gad, so I'm not going to even play with the history. But the problem you got with women,
Their status, probably the Romans didn't care too much.
the Romans probably cared, but they probably wouldn't get involved with the disputes. The Romans, have you noticed the Islamic societies have kind of issue, the Middle Eastern societies have kind of an issue with women today even? Yeah, and they've always had that. I mean, you know, I've gone to detail about the Gynoeciums and the Greek culture. And guess what? The Hebrew culture, whenever we talk about Oriental cultures, we're talking about Oriental cultures here. We're not talking about Western culture yet. When you have Western culture, you have Greek culture mixed with Christian culture. And guess what? We're just on the beginning of that, right? When you have the Greek and the Roman culture came into it to make Western culture. And Western culture is really great. Ladies, Roman culture gave women more rights than anything. Matter of fact, the other place where the women had a lot of rights in the ancient world is Egypt. And you see what happened? Remember, Alexandria northern Africa became a huge part for the Catholic Church. So a lot of the Catholic Church, the doctrines that came out of the Orthodox and the Catholic Church, well, we can go on and on. If you didn't learn this in Western Civ, this huge Western Civ stuff. But my point is this. In Jerusalem, they were supposed to follow Pilate's rules. And I suspect if they had tried to lithiate Christ,
Probably right, because the Romans would not have been happy if they'd done that.
on the other hand, Herod Antipas was not nearly as bloodthirsty as his father, Herod Agrippa. However, Herod Antipas, what did he do that was so famous? You guys know what he did. Yeah, he locked up John's head for his daughter. Oh.
So did he have some special say-so that he could execute people?
Herod, yeah, remember the tetrarchs. Herod was one of the tetrarchs, and I don't have a picture of the tetrarchs. Originally, Herod Agrippa controlled the 4 regions in the Galilee, Judea, in the Levant. The only place he didn't control originally was the strip of Syria. There's a strip of Syria that the Romans had a guy there, and he wasn't considered a tetrarch. He was one of the what Pilate was. Oh man, I've been reading that word over and over again. You skip over it so many times. Praetorium. Praetorium? Anyway, the head of an area. What happened was Herod Agrippa controlled the 4 regions in that area except for this one, which was controlled by the Syrian Petrarch? Whatever.
Praetor?
We're getting closer. We're getting close to the word. This was Justice. Anyway, in Centurion, I've got all those guys. I don't give you the history. I give you the people, right? But anyway, here was where they had it. Now, Herod Agrippa controlled all 4. When Herod Agrippa died, it was split up, and it was split up into 4. And it was, I don't remember all the names. I had all the names in the thing. But anyway, 2 of the Herod's sons lost their tetrarchs very quickly because they were incompetent idiots. The main one was Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was the first place that they took back. The Romans just sent in a legion, and it was a Fraudus, we believe it's a Fraudus 6 or 4. Anyway, it's in Centurion. But they sent in a legion to quell the problem and sent in a praetor, I think that's it. Anyway, and that's all in Centurion, how that happened. But basically, they sent him into Jerusalem, and they sent him to, I think he got whacked. It was an accident. It was a total accident, but he got whacked. That was it. The Herod that was in charge of this area, they didn't put a tetrarch over it. They put it under the Judea area. And when that happened, he got sent to Gaul. He got sent to the Mediterranean Sea, to the southern Med, to all the resorts. No, that weren't resorts. The Rhineland, you guys don't realize it, but at this time in the world, the Romans were fighting battles in Gaul and fighting battles in England. And it was huge. Part of the problem with the legions here, I talked about in Centurion over and over again, is the legions were being forced to send some of their legionnaires and centurions, especially up into the Gaul and up into England. So they were depleted constantly of their best troops, which was a real problem for them because they're trying to maintain an even strain here. And Levant is a critical area in the world, especially for the Romans. Now, the next thing that happened was Herod Antipas was given power over the other tetrarch here. And so his son, I don't know, I think he had an accident, but he may have been sent to Gaul. The writings, because when people have accidents, it's not as clear, right? And a lot of the documents that we know existed, because when these things happen, what do you think happened? Like, what do you think happened? Like, you've got Roman dudes here, right? Romans are really well known for their documentation and their regulation and their, basic problems they have, right? Because they keep track of everything. That's part of the problem of their whole society. Even as part of the problem of the Roman society today or the Italian society today, they got to keep track of everything. Well, what happened, do you think, when these events occurred? No, they reported it. It's just the letters, they're probably in the Vatican. We don't know. But there are all kinds of letters. Well, and if the letters aren't, they're probably on papyrus and vellum. Vellum lasts a long time. Papyrus, not so much. But if they're written on papyrus or vellum, and I've told you how they did this, right? The Libreus comes in, and by the way, there's Libraei in the legion. We know it. One of the principales of the centuries. Every century had a centurion, an optio, a signifer, a tesarius, and a librae. The librae was the guy that kept the schedules, and he was the lowest of the low of all the principales in the century. But the libraeus was a guy who could read and write. Woo! So the Libraeus would write the correspondence and write the things for the centurion and for the legion, and just like people wrote letters. And remember, I told you they wrote, the Libraeus kept a copy, they sent the copy, and the guy who wrote the letter kept a copy. So there's 3 copies. The problem, though, is how long does papyrus last? Well, my brother-in-law keeps his manual for his Weber grill in the Weber grill, but he's in Texas, and it's outside in the elements. So when I opened it up, I knew what it was going to say, so I didn't need it. But when I opened it up, guess what? It's totally connected to the steel. If I were to try to remove it, it would have torn apart, and it was like soaking wet. So, okay, that was not the best place to keep your manual for your Weber grill, but it's a good place, right? The problem is that if you keep your papyrus in this kind of location, what's going to happen to your papyrus letters?
They're made out of grass, basically.
And by the way, are you going to copy the letters? No. The reason we have all the documents we have is some smart guy, figured out, somebody was like, maybe this is an important document. Maybe I should make a copy of this. And so he took it to the Xerox machine, right? No, he can't copy it. Until finally, we get the printing press, right? So anyway, there are probably bazillions. The Archcode documents are so. If you haven't read the Archcode documents, you ought to read them. They're probably online. I've got a little book of the Archcode documents. But the Archcode documents has the letter from Pilate about Christ to the Senate in Rome, has the letter about the results of Christ, the execution of Christ, in a letter to Rome about, things weren't very happy. There's also a letter from the Senate to Pilate. And Pilate was actually a very successful guy in his work, a praetor, whatever. He was very successful.
He was a
Prefect.
prefect.
That's it, prefect, yes. That is correct, prefect. That's the word we've been looking for. Yeah, like a prefect in a school in Hogwarts. No, not quite, almost. But he was the prefect, and he was actually really good because he got the tribute to Rome where the guy before him, Valerius Augustus, whatever, did not. Valerius Augustus kept all the Greek or the citizens of Judea under a thumb like this, where what Pilate did is Pilate started going after the zealots and the rebels. That was the difference. So Pilate basically did keep the people under the thumb, but he let them have freedom. And according to my book, of course, it was Abinadar, the centurion, that advised him to do that. And he got more tribute because the people were free to do what they needed to do. Anyway, the politics of this is huge. And why doesn't John ever tell us about the politics? Because it's totally common knowledge. I mean, completely common knowledge. If you live in the United States, you should know about North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, New York. You know that we're states. You know that we have elections. You know that people change, parties and stuff like that. This was happening, except it was even simpler politics because it's under, a republic, the Republic of Rome, which was under an empire at the time. And also these are all imperial areas because Herod Antipas was a king. One of the 4 tetrarchs. The tetrarchs were kings, except when the Romans began to take over the areas. So in this time, we have one prefect and we have one tetrarch. And then there's also another prefect up in the Syrian area. So anyway, this stuff is totally historical. That's why I love to teach this stuff in this manner. Anyway, so it says that this was a Semeion, and then makes this comment. The people spoke up, we've heard from the law that the Messiah will remain forever. So how can you say the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man? Wow. And as I said, this was to the Greeks. And you notice this is a very long statement in Greek. But it's only like a really short kind of statement in the translation. But we'll see what it says. The people answer, we have heard out of the law that Christ abideth forever. And how sayest thou, the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man? He concluded for himself, certainly accordingly to him, that is the people. They concluded for himself. Although it's in a singular, I think. Let's see what it says in the Greek here. He answered, because oikos, the throng, is a singular verb, even though it's a throng. He concluded for himself, that's the throng, certainly accordingly to him, the throng. We have heard from out from among of the nomo, the law, that because the Christus, the anointed one, it stays to or into the age. And in what way or how much you make a logical argument, that or because it's necessary to be raised high, exalted, the offspring of the anthro, the man-faced human or man, is a certain one or thing. And this is a question word tense. Remember, this is our question word. A certain one or thing, anyone or someone, is he, the huios, the offspring of the man-faced. Accordingly, the throng concluded for herself to him. We have heard from out of the law that the Christ stays into the age. And in what way you make a logical argument that it's necessary to be raised high, exalted, the offspring of the man-faced. A certain one is he, the offspring of the man-faced. And this is the offspring, the huios of man. That, we translate it as the Son of Man, but it's the offspring. The offspring is a masculine verb. So son ain't too far, but it's not, like I said, I like offspring better. Anyway, this, let's see, I may have some comments in here about the specifics, but this was not incorporated much into Hebrew thought or law. This did come out of the apocryphal era. We don't study Apocrypha. Man, it's in every Bible until 1826. It's in every Bible that Luther wrote. It's in every Bible that was printed on a Gutenberg press. But we don't have it. I got it in my Bible. But it's really funny, isn't it? So 1826, you need to read the Apocrypha and understand the Apocrypha a little bit. I've done a class in it before. But the important part of the Apocrypha is really the idea of the Messiah comes out of the Apocrypha. There are indications in the Old Testament about the Messiah. So don't get me wrong, people get all wanged about this, but there really is, there are indications about the Messiah in the Old Testament. But the apocryphal documents, which were never separated from the Bible by anybody until 1826, really get into the idea of the Messiah. That's why they're so important. That may be why they're so disappeared. Anyway.
What happened in 1826?
In 1826.
Some council or something?
No. Okay. Yeah, I guess I guess I had to tell the story again. One of my favorite rabbit trails.
Set a timer.
You don't remember? I have to remind you because that means other people don't know or weren't reminded. What happened before the 1800s is people started wearing underwear. Nobody wore underwear until about the middle of the 1700s. The 1750s were the beginning of the age of underwear, and mainly it was because of the cotton trade. Cotton trade started, and the greatness was once they had underwear, you had lots of cotton. And by the beginning of the 1800s, there was lots of cotton. So what did you do with that cotton? You made paper out of it. We did not make wood out of paper until around
Paper out of wood.
wood out of paper until around the 1900s. Paper out of wood, wood out of paper. Anyway, we think that all paper, that wood is, or paper becomes from wood, but it doesn't. Matter of fact, almost all good paper comes from linen. And so there were linen. You ever heard of linen pickers, penny novels, all that stuff? if you've read any of the Victorian literature, you might have read about some of the women, especially, that were employed in the workhouses in factories making paper and books. And they were making paper and books because they were called rag pickers, and they were paid pretty well, but their purpose was to separate wool. You can't make paper out of wool, and silk, and make paper out of silk. They would resell or redo some of those fabrics, and they'd also check in the pockets, because sometimes they would find pounds and bills and money in the pockets. But they would take all the linen, all the cotton, and they would pull the buttons off of it, and anything that was metal or whatever, and they'd put it in, and they'd make it into paper. So there was huge amounts of paper beginning at the 1800s, beginning of the 1800s. So much paper that the British Bible Society said we could get a Bible into the hands of every person in the world. Families were able to afford Bibles because Bibles were $50 a piece, which is like $500 a piece today. So they take loans out to get their Bible. But Bibles were cheap enough for the average person to have. However, the British Bible Society had a problem. How do we make the Bibles cheap enough to give away or sell at a low price? We got lots of them. How do we make this work? So what did they do? They cut out the Apocrypha. Now, the reason they cut out the Apocrypha, even though the Church of England, and the Anglicans, and the Orthodox, and the Catholics, and the Lutherans, and everybody say the Lutherans have this new thing, and so, well, actually the Anglicans do too, that the Apocrypha are not good. They're good for history and for teaching, but not good for inspiration of theology. Yes. Although the theology is supposed to come out of it, there are issues with some of the apocryphal documents, and so they recognize that. So because of that, and also, if Martin Luther had chosen, what would Martin Luther have done?
Taken out Revelation.
He would have taken out 2 Peter, Revelations, Hebrews, Jude, and James. He would have taken out 5 because in his Bible, he moved those books to the end of the New Testament, and they're the New Testament Apocrypha, if you didn't know. But he also took the Apocrypha of the Old Testament. It was Martin Luther who did this, who caused this. And why this was, yeah, I can explain that too. But anyway, the big deal is they pulled the Apocrypha out, but not those books. And so when the British Bible Society in 1826 published their Bible that everybody could afford and buy, and they did, it didn't include the apocryphal documents. Now, why did Martin Luther pull the apocryphal documents out? This is really important. Because of the Council of Jamnia, which, if you read about it, some people today say, oh, there was no Council of Jamnia. But in about 100 AD, the Jewish rabbis were getting really concerned about 2 things. The loss of the Mishnah. I guess I explained Mishnah. The loss of the Mishnah, the loss of the Talmud, and also about they were worried about the Christians were going around with the apocryphal documents and also with Christian documents. The apocryphal documents, almost all were written in Greek originally because they came out of the Septuagint, LXX. And so the rabbis were really concerned about the fact that there were these Greek documents that were purported to be, Hebrew documents, and also the Christians, those rascally Christians, the Teen Hodos guys, had their documents which were all in Greek. The New Testament is all in Greek, right? And so what did they do? They made a decree. Anything in Greek is not part of the Tanakh, the scriptures of the Hebrews, and everything that's in Hebrew or Aramaic is. And that was the Council of Jamnia. I think it really existed around 90, 100 AD. So they ordered them to write down the Mishnah. The Mishnah had never been written down before this, because the Mishnah is the oral Torah. It's not supposed to be written down. It's an oral Torah passed through the rabbis. So they wrote down the Mishnah. You have the Babylon Mishnah, the Babylon Talmud, actually, and you have the Alexandrian, the Jerusalem Talmud. There's supposed to be also an Alexandrian and a Galil Talmud, but we don't know. We haven't found those copies. Yes, sir.
I've heard the term midrash. Is that the same thing as the Mishnah?
No, the midrash is basically the part of. I should have brought. I didn't bring any of those copies, But if you look a page of the Talmud, has the Mishnah, and then it has the Midrash. The Midrash is the part of the Talmud that are commentary on the Mishnah. And so the arguments, and a lot of them are in Aramaic, a lot of them are in French, some are in, I don't think any are in English. I think some are in German. Some may be in Latin or Greek. Anyway, they didn't like Greek. They're really anti-Greek. But if you go look, this is the Midrash is that commentary on the mikvah. So on the Mishnah. Did I say it right? Anyway, I know this gets complicated, right? This is the kind of thing that's kind of the foundation of historical knowledge and documents about the Old Testament, New Testament, all this stuff. It's like the history of the times, right? The stuff that we know all about our nation today and the world today to a degree. But these things were happening all over, of course, but they're even simpler than they are today. So that should make us happy, right? But anyway, where were we with this? So the Mishnah in the Talmudic documents, the Council of Jamnia is what, when Martin Luther put his stuff together, he didn't necessarily agree with he didn't agree with the Hebrew rabbis because he kept the Apocrypha. The Hebrew rabbis took the Apocrypha right out of the Septuagint, all the Greek stuff, and went into the garbage can. But he kept it. Now, some would argue this is a problem with modern Judaistic thought, right? Because they've rejected the Greek documents that were the inner year documents, the year, this is the reason we reject it, which is we don't reject it. The reason we ignore it is because the Council of Jamnia did, Martin Luther followed along with that, a lot of the other scholars in the Reformation did the same thing, and now we're stuck. Even though every Bible in Christendom until 1826 included the Apocrypha. So anyway, I think this is, it's high comedy if it wasn't so serious, right? It's high comedy that we've lost these things. Anyway, here's an important point. The people understood exactly what Jesus was talking about. They understood that he was saying he would die. They also concluded that Jesus was the Christ. Right?
Or at least accepted his claim.
What's that?
I said, or at least accepted his claim.
Well, yeah. What's interesting to me, okay, they are saying the Christ should abide. And by the way, that's where I was going from the very beginning. Rambam in the 1400s is a guy who took all of the Jewish teachings, and I've done this before. I've taught Rambam's teaching. Rambam, it's not a pejorative. He was the greatest rabbi of his age in the 1400s. He's the guy that gave us this, by the way, in the synagogues, right? The Jewish people never did this because the Ten Commandments are the synopsis of the law. So if you were to do this, this is like kind of bad. But Rambam allowed this to be done, and this marks a lot of the synagogues from the 1400s because this is what the churches did. And there are reasons in the 1400s why the synagogues wanted to appear more like churches, what do you call those guys, the Spanish Inquisition and Inquisitions and other things. But also Rambam was I guess you call him a progressive in the viewpoint of the Hebrew thought. He put together the rules for the Messiah. And one of the main rules for the Messiah that came out of the Apocrypha, by the way, is the Messiah must abide forever. And why is this a big deal? What happened to all the other Messiahs?
They all died.
They all died. The thing of the history, the Maccabees, there's Maccabees 1, 2, 3, and 4. And Maccabees 1 is considered great history. 2 is okay history. 3, you ought to read it. 4, they're kind of prophetic-ish documents. They're very interesting documents, the last 2. But Maccabees 1 is considered great history, as good as any history we have. But in the Maccabees, the point of the Maccabean era was Maccabees means hammer. And Maccabees had 7 sons, and the 7 sons, each one were declared the king and high priest of Judah, even though Maccabees was probably a Levite, but not an Aaronite. He wasn't a priest. You see a problem with that? You can't be high priest if you're not from the Aaron's family, right? You can be a Levite, but not a. So anyway, Maccabees was a Levite, we think. That's what the Maccabees tells us. But he claimed that his sons, each son was high priest and king. If you're high priest and king, you are the Messiah, the anointed one. Right? You are anointed. And that's what they did. The problem was each one of them died. That's why in this era, the big deal was each of those messiahs died. And so the big deal to the people, and this, by the way, is a post-late date apocryphal idea, because Rambam took this from this point, that the people of the time believed that the problem with the previous messiahs was they died. And so therefore the Messiah must abide into the age. And that's the whole point, that he can't die. And Rambam's point, by the way, Rambam separated into 2 messiahs. You had one who was king and one who was high priest. That way you didn't have the problem. I think the high priest dies and the king revives him, or vice versa. Rambam had some really interesting rambling thoughts. But anyway, it's a really interesting thing. But the people themselves at this time, which means we know that Rambam's ideas and the ideas that were later that came from Rambam himself, Rambam likely got them, not just from the Talmudic and the Mishnah sources, but also from the New Testament sources, or at least other sources some we may not have. So anyway, there is a Tanakh allusion in 2 Samuel. Tanakh is the Torah and the Psalms and the prophets. That's what the Jewish people call them. The Tanakh is what we consider the Bible. Now remember, the Bible, not with the Apocrypha. So it's very interesting. But in God's promise, after the king was settled in his palace, and God, Lord, to give him rest from all his enemies around him, he said to Nathan the prophet, "Here I am, living in a house of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent." They replied, "Whatever you have in mind, go ahead, do it, for the Lord is with you." And let's see. I'll just skip down to here. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who built a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So Rambam and the people here that are talking got this from Old Testament Tanakh sources. That's cool. That's good. There's, let's see, and then Nathan reported to David, etc. I won't go back to there, but I'll remind you, you should take, I think I listed these. If you didn't, write them down, because rabbinic context means, okay, I guess I'll explain that to you a little bit. You guys probably remember, but rabbinic context, in the old, in this period, everything was memorized. So if you knew the Septuagint, you had memorized the Septuagint. So there is no chapter and verses. There are no chapters, verses, no paragraphs, no statements, no sentences, nothing. There just are. So when I take a statement or a quote from a document like that, what does it imply? That you know the whole sequence. Exactly. So when there's something quoted, now this is an allusion, not a quote. This is an allusion also. But if I make a rabbinic comment, like a quote, especially in the New Testament or even the Old Testament, that is an allusion to the entire text of the section or the book, even, depending on how you're looking at it. So you just can't. We love to take, Jesus wept, right? God is love. It doesn't mean anything without the context. The rabbi would smack it. You know, even the early Christians would probably smack it.
My personal least favorite, judge not, lest you be judged. Which everyone wants to preach at us about.
Yeah, you know.
Which in itself is judgment.
Yeah, yes. And by the way, if you haven't noticed, the enemies of Christianity quote stuff all the time. Matter of fact, didn't Satan quote stuff to Jesus?
Yep.
That should show you the problem of taking things out of rabbinic context. But anyway, so I give you the whole rabbinic context, but I'm not going to read everything to you, so you might want to look at it yourself. And by the way, these were all added in the Septuagint. That's what the note will tell you. When it says the Psalm of David or whatever, all these comments were added in the Septuagint. They were not originally part of the Hebrew. And if you own an original Torah or Tanakh Bible, you'll find that they're taken out. Anyway, let's see. We'll go down to where the quote is. We'll run out of time anyway. All right. What is this? And I will appoint him to be my firstborn, the most exalted. He will call to me, you are my Father, my God, the rock, my Savior, and I will appoint him to be my firstborn, the most exalted of the kings of the earth. I will maintain my love to him forever, and my covenant with him will never fail. I will establish his line forever, his throne as long as the heavens endure. If his sons forsake my law and do not follow my statutes, they violate my decrees and fail to keep my commands, I'll punish their sin with the rod, their iniquity with flogging. The big point is, and I don't know why it says 30, but it's in 29, I will establish his line forever, his throne for as long as the heavens endure. That's where they get the idea that the Messiah, the Christ, is, does not die in the age. Oh, and here it is. It's repeated. Yeah. And then his line will continue forever, and his throne endure before me like the sun. It will be established forever like the moon, be faithful witness in the sky. But you have rejected, you have spurned, you have been very angry with your anointed one. Uh-oh.
So what did they think that lifted up meant then? They say, well, the Messiah lasts forever. So this lifted up, whatever they thought it meant something was going to end?
They obviously, this goes back to the Greek thing and why the Greek audience, I think, is so important for us to cogitate in our brains. In a Hebrew, if I were speaking specifically Hebrews, right, in any case, I'd probably have to explain this. But explain it to Greeks. Remember, the Greeks always logos to unstated telos. So the Greek writer would say, I don't have to tell you. All I have to do is make the logical argument to you. And he thinks, and by the way, I believe this is probably late reporting. In other words, all the hearers knew what the punchline was. They knew what the climax was. The people that were there didn't yet, but they knew that what Jesus was telling them from a Greek standpoint was straight out, yeah, they're going to kill me, right? And that's why John, by the way, explains it in the text. He says with this, Christ was explaining how he was going to die. So John didn't want you to miss it. John gave you, even if you aren't totally Greek and you're not totally paying attention, John is going to make sure that you don't miss the point. So I think this is very positive for us. But I think that as and I don't like to use the word deconstruct, but it's true. We're looking at the construction of the Greek and the arguments in the Greek. And I think that's very important because that helps us understand what's going on in this text. But it's kind of obvious that the people got it. And remember this too. This is Greek writing, or it is Greek writing, but it's also from a Greek thought. So in Greek thought, am I going to waste time telling you things you already know? No, it costs money. Everything on the page is cost me money that I add. Every word I put, every statement I put on the page, and they're all squished together. Anyway, everything that I do is costing money, and it's a logical art. It's a logos to tell us. If I come out telling you too much, what are the critics going to say? Are you an idiot? Are you a terrible writer? What's wrong with you, right? Because this isn't Greek. In Greek, it's always logos to tell us. In Hebrew, it's always synopsis body. But people don't understand that either. It's interesting. But in the Greek, it's always logos to tell us. And I'm not going to tell you all the details of the logos. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to figure it out, right? Now, the problem with us is we don't have the black background, in some cases, to fully comprehend what's going on. Oh, we wish they had added at least some of that context, right? That's why we're trying to rejigger it, rebuild it out of this. In Psalm 110 of David, a psalm, remember that's just added. That's not a negative, it just is. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And I think there's Isaiah. Isaiah is 9:7. Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, and greatness and his government and peace will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. And that's the title. Let's see. The point is, there are a lot of reasons why the people concluded quite correctly that Jesus is stating how he's going to die. But like I said, this is a Greek audience, and the Greek audience continues, and we're going to look at that next week. Whenever they talk about light and darkness, what are they talking about? What's that?
Good and evil.
Mysterion. Anytime you see light and darkness mentioned, it relates back to Mysterion. That's not a negative. Don't think of that as a negative. It's just one of those cultural artifacts that comes right out of the Greek that we have picked up. That does apply in Hebraic thought too. Anyway, we're out of time. Thanks, Father, for your word. I pray you look at us this week. In your name we pray. Amen.
So what does the word crucifix mean?